When Belle turns her subversive efforts to the townsfolk. She exposes them to her occult mirror prop and tells them about this mythical creature because she wants them to think that her father isn't actually crazy. And she wants to get the townsfolk to indulge in her occult bestiality fantasy with her. And this is the essence of Gaston. He values the objective, what he can see, what he knows is true and real. Belle, a narcissist, only values what serves herself. Says, no, I can make her the happiest and provide to her the best life, and I will stop at nothing to do this for her.
Let me tell you a tragic story. In a mythical world, one country stands alone, protecting the world against the domination of an evil, powerful wizard king, who sends his mindless minions in a relentless attack against the country, the last defense of the world against total domination by evil. The country fights valiantly, but its strength is waning and its people are exhausted without help from any other nation. The country's leader then hears of a powerful weapon which, while it could be used in the defense of his homeland, is being hidden by an international cabal of powerful interests. And so he sends his older son, who he loves exceedingly, on a long and dangerous quest to acquire this weapon, in order to aid the noble defense. But his son fails in his mission, ultimately losing sight of his father's orders, becoming corrupted by the cabal, and is killed. The second son of the ruler is then approached by a powerful member of this international group, a wizard, who tells him that his father is wrong, even wicked, and ultimately succeeds in breaking down the family and using the ruler's son to send him into madness, while the wizard exploits the power vacuum to take control of the country and ultimately instills his own loyal protege as king. The second son is duly rewarded for his subservience with a position at court and a strategically advantageous marriage to a foreign princess. This is the tragic end to the country and the family as it had been, unbroken for hundreds of years. In this story, the heroes are those who uphold their national interest in the face of all odds, respect family roles, and resist control by international usurpers. The antagonists care more for their cosmopolitan scheming than the good of that country, and are all too happy to break any group, including this family, who wish to preserve anything different or challenge their power. They break families apart in service to a version of the good, which coincidentally also increases their power and control, all while manipulating the resistance from the inside into self-doubt and weakness. As with the second son, they get him to defy his father in service of their agenda, and they use some vague, intellectual, and impersonal vision of the good to do so. As you've probably guessed, this is a version of J.R.R. Tolkien's classic fantasy, The Lord of the Rings. It keeps the main beats of the story, characters, and roles. Why couldn't this be the real story of The Lord of the Rings? Does this retelling seem wrong to you? Why? I'm going to try to suss that out. Here's my take. When enjoying a piece of fiction, you must suspend your disbelief and rest in the authorial depiction. It is possible, if we refuse to do this, that we may come up with any number of interpretations of the piece, usually because we ignore the signals given by the author. Right and wrong in a piece of fiction are squarely under the control of the author, who is usually trying to communicate a theme to the audience. In the words of renowned YouTube literary critic John Doyle,
how much time we spend with each of the characters, which perspectives we see them from, what we see them doing, what we don't see them doing, all of these things affect our perception of the story, who we sympathize with, who we're rooting for, etc.
In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien himself had nothing against filial piety or patriotism, but was using the story to illustrate a different theme, and one which, in the case of the steward Denethor, tested the limits of these values. But it's important to realize that themes within a work do not imply contradictions of other themes which are not present or emphasized within it. Tolkien is testing the limit of filial piety in this story, but not contradicting its importance writ large. If we demanded that of literature, we would be demanding it to become a sterile, philosophical ponderance like this one, and that's no fun. Literature is true to life, where situations make us weigh values based on the classic determinants: substance, the actual act itself; circumstance, what's going on around the act to make it moral or immoral; and intention, what did the actor think he was doing by performing the act. In a story itself, the substance can be equated with the theme. Pick your favorite novel and ask yourself what you learned from it. That's the substance, the theme. This idea, this substance or theme, is applied through narrative to circumstance and intention. According to the creativity of the author, this becomes, true to life, very messy and interesting, considering not only the abstract theme, but the theme as it collides with reality. This is actually a part of moral philosophy itself, as Thomas Aquinas says. Actions are about singular matters, and so it is necessary for the prudent man to know both the universal principles of reason and the singulars about which actions are concerned. Singulars meaning circumstance and intention. And in literature, these serve at the pleasure of the author's whim, even though we are able to have a pretty clear view of substance in the abstract. Our lives will attest how tricky this can become once the ideal meets the circumstance and the intention. And this is where literature is at its finest, simulating these difficult situations as we watch characters navigate gray areas of moral conflict just like we do every day. This is not a renunciation of morality, but morality in practice. It was necessary for the character Faramir to defy his father based on the circumstance. Even though, according to the substance, defying your father is typically wrong, according to the conceit of this narrative, it was ultimately morally mandated. Why? Because that's the narrative Tolkien wanted. That's the circumstances he created and the theme he wished to express, the conflict he wished to explore. As we enjoy and analyze themes of morality in fiction, one can choose to use plot beats of an existing story to create a different interpretation. The sort of subversive, purposefully wrong take like my version of Lord of the Rings here. But if we're ever confused as to whether or not the take is a genuine interpretation of the work or a subversive rewrite, we should realize that the rewrite version will never fit perfectly with the actual facts of the narrative. That's the dead giveaway. If the inconsistencies this retelling creates are so dissonant with the original piece, the story has to gloss over and misinterpret story beats or even just change them entirely. The reason for this is that the original author had complete control over the story. They were able to construct the characters and their motivations however they wanted. If the character is bad, their motivations will be communicated as such, selfish or arrogant or whatever.
They're never nasty or mean.
Why do they have to be that way? Because the story is coming from the author's imagination. He is the god of the work, with ultimate knowledge of the hearts and minds of all his characters. It's as simple as that. So, why is my Lord of the Rings retcon wrong? Put simply, it's not how Tolkien wrote it. It's a bastardization of the themes and intent of the novel, to the point where the story is a different story entirely.
Like, sure, these words are nice, but only because I get to decide what picture they paint.
And while it may be fun to construct a subversive retelling of the story, as modern Hollywood loves doing, it should be acknowledged that the reinterpretation is creating a whole new story. It just happens to occupy a borrowed imaginary world. For example, when Disney portrays Cruella de Vil as a glamorous, down-on-her-luck fashion genius, rather than a comically evil psychopath, of course, there is just no way to plausibly interpret the original Cruella as sympathetic in any way, and the audience isn't supposed to. She's mean, shallow, contemptuous, and cruel. She serves the story in her function as the embodiment of total evil. That's just who she is. Why? Because that's the way she's written, and the imagination of the author dictates the circumstances and intentions of the story. In Disney's retelling, although they pay lip service to how Cruella became evil, they have to maintain her likability as a protagonist, so they don't go into how she actually developed her most distinctive personality traits, which, of course, are extremely evil: her deranged kleptomania and hatred of animals, especially puppies. They create a badass, Hollywood-approved, edgy, fashionista anti-hero. What they are really doing is creating a new character. It is not the story as it actually existed. It's something new. And that's fine as far as it goes. Go crazy. Subvert everything. Up is down. War is peace. Black is white. Whatever. Sure. There's something very nihilistic and fun about it. It's creative, I guess, in its own little way. Gets a little repetitive, in my opinion, after a while. But hey, I like a good puppy murderer as much as the next guy.
You know?
One thing it's objectively not, though, is the original story.
Next!
So, with all that out of the way, let's talk about John Doyle's new Hollywood-style subversive retelling of Disney's Beauty and the Beast. John is a right-wing YouTuber and political commentator who around Christmas time of 2021 published a video called Why Beauty and the Beast is Implicitly Right-Wing, where he retells the story, framing Gaston as the hero and Belle as the antagonist. I'll get into some of the ideological elements of this later, but I'd first like to talk about the media or literary criticism. Remember, the retelling in this way will have to shift things around to try and shoehorn the author's clear intent into something else. As John acknowledges,
anyone who watches this film will easily identify Gaston as the antagonist.
That should be full stop in terms of the claim that Gaston is the true hero. Like the writers of Disney's Cruella, John isn't interpreting the movie so much as he's constructing a new one. And since we know that this will inevitably show up in inconsistencies from the source material, let's present examples of that. We'll limit ourselves to 3, although there are far more.
Gaston is nice to his dysgenic manlet friend.
Gaston is disrespectful and rude to LeFou, throwing him into a snowdrift, and mean to him, constantly beating him up. He can only be said to be nice to LeFou in that he tolerates him for his limited utility and ego fanning.
So Gaston berates his dysgenic manlet friend and defends Belle's father, because even though Gaston recognizes that Belle's father is a weak man, he still respects tradition and hierarchy, that her father still has ownership of her.
Gaston actually has contempt for Maurice, calling him crazy, having him physically removed from the bar when he's distressed, and throwing him into the insane asylum, even after he realizes that Maurice was telling the truth about the existence of the beast. He is only feigning respect for Maurice in order to help his chances with Belle.
Which, given the time period in which the story takes place, she was probably reading like revolutionary, proto-Marxist literature, and Gaston was trying to save her from that.
It's acknowledged by Belle herself that what she's reading is a fantasy novel of some kind. She even states that explicitly when she says she loves to read fiction, not non-fiction. If you watch the video yourself, you'll find that there are many more. I don't want to pick this to death because it's boring and 3 is enough. So he's creating a new subversive version, not a true interpretation of the movie. And again, go crazy. But as with my retelling of Lord of the Rings or Disney's of Cruella, we should at least acknowledge that this isn't based on the actual piece, but on a new thing, the rules of which were created by John Doyle, the author, not John Doyle, the film critic. It strikes me that John is demanding his preferred values receive pride of place, even though it does not fit the circumstances and intentions within the narrative. He may have chosen, should he have written the story, to have the object be heroic manliness or the beauty of a small community. These are good themes, and honestly, I think they could use some love in our media today for sure. But so, the theme of this story isn't the one that John would have chosen, but is that really a good reason to disregard the substance of the theme of this story? Given that the circumstances and intentions dictated by the imagination of the author are good, the only fight John could pick with the story could really be the theme, and there is nothing inherently contradictory about the themes in Beauty and the Beast, that there's more to life than beauty, and John's preferred themes of heroism and community. The film is not glorifying obesity. It's not saying women should shave their heads and not their armpits. It's making a simple and frankly old-fashioned point about how we should treat one another. John doesn't even explicitly disagree with this theme, although more on that later. He more so criticizes the circumstances and intentions of the movie, In John's version,
Belle, at her core, possesses that revolutionary chaotic spirit, which is the consequence of unchecked feminine energy, not guided by a mother, not checked by her father, and influenced by proto-Marxist literature, and now she can only find purpose through chaos.
and Maurice is this ruthless, industrialist progressive.
Belle gets back home and we learn that her father is an inventor, which in context means that this guy is literally facilitating the propagation of the Industrial Revolution, which will inevitably destroy the fabric of the town he's a part of through automation, through degeneration. But he does this in the name of his pride, winning first prize at the fair or whatever. So he has some form of psychopathic personality disorder. And then he defends Belle's interest in books, which makes sense because that revolutionary literature exists in part as a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution that he exploits for his own pursuit of glory, since this fixation on creating new material things bled into the study of the abstract and the immaterial. But since that largely predated and transcends us, the new information had to just be criticizing all of the traditional information and basically throwing it all out in the name of progress or whatever.
It's as new as the new Cruella. Belle is a Marxist, her father is a materialist, industrialist, and Gaston is a tradcon. This is not serious criticism because John doesn't control that aspect of the narrative, the author does. The theme, however, the actual moral message, that's something that, were it actually wrong, John could have attacked directly, but he doesn't, choosing instead to retell the circumstances and intentions and attack that. If you're a fan of John, you may be thinking, hey, man, you do realize this is just a joke, right? And, well, sure. But since it's a joke, then there's no harm in clarifying why it should be taken as just that, in case some people got confused. Also, a lot of John's video was a joke, but some of it was serious. He's not a comedian. He's trying to make a real point. But which part is which? Is it the physiognomy part? Is it the Belle being a Marxist part? Are these just exaggerations? How do we tell? Are we meant to tell? Maybe it's just a vibe. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. But here's my issue. I understand that part of the joke is the outsized response. Angry responses to the joke is part of the fun. This is something only some left-wing people have caught on to. While in the online left, offense and outrage is part of the cultural language and currency, in the online right, provocation occupies a weirdly similar role, in my opinion. This odd paradigm is set up where, for the left, anything even slightly out of step is considered deeply offensive, while on the right, considering even the most outrageous thing offensive is cringy. Half the point of John's video is to be ridiculous, poke the left in the eye, and laugh when they hyperventilate and take him seriously. Another successful triggering, and I understand that, so I'll try to contain my anger.
But someday, I'm gonna boil over!
But then again, John is only somewhat joking. In reality, he's employing a rhetorical strategy which has become the refuge of the right wing in many cases. They are self-aware that many of their views are well outside the Overton window, so they use humor as a tool to get the audience used to their ideas while under the cloak of plausible deniability. Nobody wants to be the humorless woke scold shutting down people's good time. It's just a joke, so calm down, right? This is an emotional strategy to hook the listener. I'm not a humorless woke scold, so I'll just shut my mouth and avoid the issue. The jokes definitely have some edge behind them, but is it really worth the trouble to come off as so humorless and petty? It's a rhetorical trick used to shield an actual argument John is making from criticism. Through jocose exaggeration, John can always respond, whatever the critic may say, that they've taken him too seriously and missed the point. This strategy to muddy and confuse the waters of dialogue in order to win, rather than inform or grasp at the truth, is typically called sophistry, the relativistic ancient Greek perspective represented by Thrasymachus' assertion in Plato's Republic that justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. The arguments presented by a sophist are not meant to illuminate the listener, but simply to use words as a tool to force him into intellectual submission. John notes that Gaston
He's roughly the size of a barge. I mean, this guy is it. He's loved by his community. He rejects books and sources because those are how weak people justify their beliefs since they're incapable of original thought. He takes care of his dysgenic manlet friend. He's dancing with him. Like, this guy's fantastic. I'd be on his team every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Gaston begins basically like rhetorically psyoping the townsfolk to garner support for his cause, basically just like inventing these bad outcomes that could potentially happen to scare people. And because he's respected, within seconds, the men are marching with Gaston to the castle to kill the beast. Whereas Gaston literally just makes up a few stories, and within 5 minutes, he has an armed caravan about to storm the castle. They think the only way to save the objective and stay in the fight is to ask for mercy. So the beast lets him go, and then gets distracted by Belle, and so Gaston capitalizes on this, and he stabs the beast. The true moral of the story is that the nature of nature is right. What is natural is therefore right. Inversion of the natural order is inherently chaotic and therefore destructive.
This is the actual argument, buried under layers and layers of irony, provocative side comments, and exaggeration. Gaston is the leader because he is strong. That's the natural order of things, and even when he has to, as John concedes, manipulate the townspeople into going to war, it's okay, because he is the strong natural leader of the town. It's also, as it so happens, his real problem with Beauty and the Beast. He knows he's not in control of the circumstances and intentions within the story. He knows he's contorting them beyond all reasonable recognition. That's why he uses a semi-ironic tone as he does it. What, you couldn't tell he was just joking? But the thing he's really getting at is not the false pretenses. It's the substance, the theme of Beauty and the Beast, the true theme with which he actually disagrees. Thrasymachus thought it only the natural order that the strong rule over the weak by virtue of their superior force. It's a crisp line of reasoning, and one which certainly fits John's version of Gaston. Thrasymachus's notion, like John's, of a good life is tied to material strength, power, and progeneration. I disagree, but I do personally think this perspective is more in touch with reality than many a deranged academic excretion on nature and justice, if that helps at all. But this shows, I think, that the heart of John's critique is not so much based on his subversive rewrite, but rather upon the fact that he disagrees with the central theme of Beauty and the Beast as it actually is. He disagrees not with the circumstances or intentions he misconstrues, and knowingly misconstrues, by the way. He throws in some feminist rage bait about gender roles and some shock jock quips to get you off the scent. But the heart of his objection to Beauty and the Beast is actually the root message of the story itself, not John's version, the actual version. The central theme of Beauty and the Beast is appearances can be deceiving. So we shouldn't be too quick to judge based on how people may externally present themselves to us. We can see this theme from the first scene where the beautiful enchantress cloaks her beauty as a test through the portrayal of the antagonist as classically handsome and the primary love interest as a hideous beast. It's pretty easy to spot, and for most people, it's not groundbreaking stuff. It's just traditional good manners. This is what John actually disagrees with. Cleverly, he never directly addresses it, but we can see his feelings for it based on
Her father's weak, he's old. This poor, ugly old woman came to his castle asking for shelter from a storm, and she told him that she could offer him a rose. And the beast, who at the time was a prince, said no because she was ugly and poor. And at first you might think that this is based because she had poor physiognomy, but it wasn't. It was actually proto-Coomerism, because then the woman transforms back into her natural form as a beautiful princess, and the prince immediately starts simping for her. So it wasn't a rejection of her because he inferred from her poor physiognomy that she would have poor character, but rather that he couldn't just lust after her. And Gaston correctly figures that since he's clearly the best male in town, he deserves Belle because she's the most beautiful girl in town. And Gaston, by the way, is desired by virtually every woman in town. And then in less than 90 seconds, she agrees to spend the rest of her life in a castle with a monster. And you can say, oh, she did it to save her father. But it's like, first of all, this is 1700s, 1800s France, and that guy is old and fat. He's sick now. He's got maybe 2 years left. Gaston does this because he's a Chad. And the Beast isn't even doing this because he's a Sigma male, but rather because, again, he's basically an autistic incel.
John holds that, at least to some extent. You can judge somebody based on their physical appearance. And I agree to some extent. Somebody who is physically fit has to exhibit some amount of discipline, so the external appearance is an indicator, in this case, of an internal excellence. It's an accurate physical manifestation of a good thing in general. But what is admirable about this is not solely the physical prowess. Strength is a manifestation of a virtue possessed within the individual, which is ultimately more important. As a strong young man gets old, that discipline remains. We should applaud and admire these virtues wherever we see them. I agree with John's distaste for those who cringe from excellence. We should also acknowledge, however, that possessing one virtue does not imply possession of all virtues. People are complex, and while somebody who is physically disciplined could be a wife-beating murderer, a fat person could hypothetically be slothful but also just and brave, or any infinite combinations of infinite people, fictional and real. Just as it is reductive for Thrasymachus to say that the nature of justice rests in the physical ability of a person to assert themselves, so too is it reductive to view any virtue or vice as a primarily physical thing. While it is manifested physically, there is an ethereal aspect to virtue, one which does not immediately meet the eye. Tolkien expressed a similar point when using the small and physically weak hobbits as protagonists in his story, The Lord of the Rings. While many underestimated them throughout the story because of their size, they were ultimately the most heroic characters of all. It's not hard to imagine Ugluk mocking Merry and Pippin as dysgenic manlets. John's obsession with the physical is, in my opinion, an overcorrection to some modern notions vomited out of academia, which seems to love and embrace repulsiveness and impotence pro forma over beauty and strength. A strange line of thinking in its own right. But in his attempt to discard the ugly view, he has discarded much more. The mythically ugly old Socrates who refuted the young and handsome Thrasymachus. Beethoven, hideous and deaf, composing some of the most magnificent and beloved music of the Western canon. Frodo, the short and pudgy hobbit, saving the world. And yes, Belle, who despite the outer beauty of Gaston, loved the beast.